So a few minutes ago, I came across an article talking about Thunderspy, which supposedly is a massive vulnerability for any device prior to 2019, roughly, or any device that hasn't been patched that allows an attacker to compromise your PC via the Thunderbolt controller. And basically, this website here basically pitches this as a massive vulnerability that only takes 5 minutes to exploit on a machine with nothing more than the computer, a screwdriver, and quote-unquote some easily portable hardware. They say that they've developed 9 realistic scenarios on how their 7 vulnerabilities could be exploited, and I would say that realistic is used rather loosely because of how this attack works. The way that this basically hysteria flaring page gets away with freaking people out is because it starts off basically saying that Thunderspy is stealth, meaning that you cannot find any traces of the attack. It does not require your involvement, and it works even if you follow the best security practices and just leave your computer laying around briefly. Even if the system has secure boot, a strong password on both the BIOS and operating system, and full disk encryption. While it is true that it's vulnerable in these situations, the vulnerability itself is rather impractical to exploit, and it's pretty obvious based on the demo video, which we'll take a look at now. So, as you can see here, he's basically opening the back of this laptop.
Now I'm going to attach my spy programmer.
And what he's going to do, yeah, literally, he has to attach a programmer to the motherboard. And something you should be aware of is that SPI programmers are pretty commonplace. So, obviously it's not hard to get your hands on one, and making an SPI programmer is rather easy. In fact, there's a lot of tutorials on how to make SPI flash programmers. If I just look up how to make an SPI flash programmer, you'll find numerous videos on how to do that, how to do SPI programming. Here we go, even Arduino, how to write up and code an EEPROM with Arduino. I mean, it's fairly straightforward. So what this video is basically showing you is that
the interface with the SPI flash that is
he can basically rewrite the Thunderbolt flash, which basically the flash is where the Thunderbolt controller basically stores its firmware and uses that firmware to run, basically its code, because the Thunderbolt controller has to be programmed, it has firmware, etc. So what the vulnerability here is that Intel opted not to double check that the firmware being used on this SPI ROM, they opted not to double check that it was signed by Intel. It's not verified. And what that's allowing them to do is that they can basically write whatever firmware they want onto it, or something along those lines, basically by using the SPI flash and clicking onto that little SPI chip. So that sounds kind of scary, but considering the fact that you need your computer open, you need to be flashing to it, you need to have a clip on, you need hardware that can flash, which, yeah, it is very easy to make a portable like Raspberry Pi or Arduino flasher. But considering that you have to literally flash the system, the attack's not exactly practical. There's also the consideration that, he has to have physical access to the device. This is not a zero-step thing. The page here says that it does not require your involvement. Well, that's not quite true, because your involvement in the situation is leaving your machine available for a potential malicious actor to do this to. And that's basically your involvement. I mean, it's not literal, basic, simple, click a button involvement, but you are doing something that allows this attack to occur. So yes, it does require your involvement. But that's besides the point. So something worth noting about SPI flashing is that it's very common to SPI flash to solve numerous computer problems. So what can happen sometimes is that the flash for your BIOS, which is if you don't know, it's the lowest level, well, almost lowest level firmware on your machine that basically handles basic input-output. That's part of what BIOS stands for, by the way. Basically, if you have issues with your BIOS and you're unable to reflash it or basically reinstall the firmware on it, you can use an SPI flash clip generally to reinstall it based on the firmware that's publicly available from your manufacturer. So yeah, people do that. The enthusiast space often will flash firmware on like graphics cards with a clip. And what that allows them to do sometimes is get around software-based firmware lockdown. It doesn't always allow for, let's say, custom firmware that's not signed by the company, but often it does. But in more business-focused hardware, that would be considered an issue. So typically it's locked down with some sort of external locking clip, external locking chip that's on the main board that prevents or at least checks for signed firmware on boot with some kind of common, basically like a passphrase. And if the passphrase is not found, and this is very layman, that's not how it literally works. I know that's not how it works if you're more educated than most, but yeah. So if it can't verify that the firmware is from the manufacturer or an authorized person, then the system will simply fail to boot. That's the thing on some business machines. I think Apple also does that to verify firmware, but it's just ultimately not. If someone has physical access to your device and you have data stored on the drive that is important, basically there are more reasonable attack vectors to go about with this, other than a flash clip. I mean, sure, it does give them the possibility of rewriting your flash firmware, but again, they have to have time with your machine somehow without anyone noticing, putting a clip on, flashing this firmware, having firmware that can do something they want it to do. And yeah, like, sure, it does break down the security of the Thunderbolt port, and theoretically they could then plug in a Thunderbolt device and just start dumping the memory. But like, for just like someone like my mom or my grandparents or even my friends in college, this is not like, even, I don't know, even someone who works at a company like Intel, this is not, like a work laptop. This is not something that will like really ever be a problem for anyone. This is not something that should ever be a concern because, again, like, I mean, it's basically like saying that someone can steal money out of your bank account if you leave your account number and PIN on a piece of paper on a table in a cafe and then just walk away for a few minutes, come back and pick it up and leave. I mean, obviously, yeah, someone could do that, but the thing is, it would be fairly obvious what they were doing. I guess a better example would be like opening up the ATM, typing all of your credentials in, and then walking away for a few minutes, and then someone comes in, uses the ATM, withdraws, and then leaves, but keeps the ATM open with your session so you don't, quote-unquote, notice. I mean, if someone has physical access to your device, there's much worse things they could probably do than, flash custom Thunderbolt firmware and steal your data. But if that's a valid concern for you, yeah, sure. I mean, be upset about it. But unless you can personally say that this attack would hurt you or your company, this is not a problem you should be worried about, and you should find something else to do than freak out over what's basically someone saying, oh, it's a big problem that you can install whatever firmware you want onto this device. I mean, it's just silly. It's hysteria. It's someone just trying to get some moment in the spotlight or just even attention, in my opinion at least. There is somewhat of a vulnerability here, but I'd argue that it's just more of an issue in the design, considering business machines, than anything else. For consumer machines, this is completely irrelevant. You shouldn't worry about it. If you don't buy business laptops, then literally just ignore anything you see about Thunderspy, because this is just not relevant to you. If you're a system integrator or a business or some kind of corporation or government entity, then yeah, this is something to be worried about. If you have something important on your device and you have employees or someone who will just leave their device somewhere, I mean, yeah, this could be a problem because they could dump the memory and get data out of it. But this is like pretty much any other vulnerability. I mean, this is about as practical as the whole liquid nitrogen the RAM and dump the data off of it. It's just stupid, in my opinion. Don't worry about it. And that's all I have to say on this.